I have stood post through hailstorms that stung like gravel thrown by hand, through a bomb scare at the West Gate that emptied half of Harrogate onto the lawns in their dressing gowns, and through 6 hours of a state funeral without once shifting my weight from one boot to the other. None of it cost me what it cost me to stand in that corridor outside the nursery wing's consulting room and do nothing for 4 minutes, while every trained instinct I owned was telling me to put my shoulder through the door. I want to tell you why I didn't, and I want to tell you what I did instead, because the answer isn't as simple as courage, and it isn't as simple as luck. It was 2 days of quiet, unglamorous checking, a ledger here, a telephone call there, a name I happened to remember from a dinner conversation 11 months before, that put me in that corridor at all, armed with enough to be certain, if not yet enough to be believed. The consulting room sits at the quiet end of the nursery wing, past the schoolroom and the small sitting room where the children take their breakfast, a room fitted out decades ago for exactly the ordinary business of childhood illnesses. A padded examination table, a cabinet of plain white-painted wood, a single tall window that in the ordinary run of things let in a good deal of morning light. I had stood outside that door perhaps 24 times over 3 years, wading through ear infections and a broken wrist, and one memorable bout of chicken pox, and none of those ordinary mornings had ever asked anything more difficult of me than patience. Through the door I could hear the woman who called herself a nurse laying steel instruments out on a tray with the practiced clatter of someone who wanted it to sound practiced. I could hear the man who called himself Dr. Renshaw asking Prince Torin, in the unhurried voice of someone with nowhere else to be, whether he'd rather sit on the table or the chair. And underneath both of those ordinary sounds I could hear the particular silence of an 11-year-old boy who has decided to be brave, because no one has told him he's allowed to be anything else. There is a particular discipline to standing still while your own instincts are screaming at you to move, and it is not a discipline anyone teaches you in a single lesson. It is built the same way a callus is built, slowly, through repetition, through years of learning that the loudest impulse in your chest is very often not the wisest one, and that a guard who acts on every alarm his body raises will eventually raise a false one loud enough to cost someone dear. I had that discipline in full that morning, and I want to be honest that it did not feel like strength while I was using it. It felt like standing very close to a fire and being asked, calmly, not to flinch. I was not permitted inside. Queen Consort Morwenna had seen to that herself, not 10 minutes earlier, standing in the doorway in a soft gray morning dress with her hand resting lightly on the frame as though she were merely steadying it and not blocking it. "That will be all, Sergeant," she'd said, in the pleasant, unhurried tone she used for things she did not want questioned. "A sick room is no place for an audience. The physician needs quiet, and His Royal Highness needs his privacy. You may wait at the end of the hall." I had said, "Of course, Your Majesty," because that is what 9 years of service teaches a man to say, and I had turned on my heel and walked the length of that corridor exactly as ordered, my boots striking the parquet in the same even rhythm they always did, giving away nothing. It was only when I reached the far end, out of sight of the door, that I stopped walking away from the problem and started, very quietly, walking back towards solving it. I had asked Captain Ashcombe, less than an hour before, to come to that corridor himself and hear what I had to tell him. He'd promised he would, the moment he'd finished seeing to the delegation gathering at the East Gate. I did not know, standing there with my back against the cold stone and my eyes on that closed door, whether he would arrive in time, or whether, in time, had already come and gone without my noticing the exact second it slipped past. To make sense of what I did next, and of why I trusted my own judgment over the word of a queen consort and a man with a case full of gleaming instruments, I have to take you back 2 days, to an empty room full of old maps and a boy who had stopped sleeping well. My name is Corin Hale. I have served the Crown of Eldermore for 11 years, the first 6 of them in the Army's Special Investigations Branch, learning the unglamorous trade of checking things twice, travel documents, supply manifests, the paperwork of men who wanted very badly for nobody to look closely at their paperwork. I left that work not because I tired of it, but because a superior officer with more foresight than tact told me I had the patience for protection duty, and the eye for something worse than a soldier's threat, which is a courtier's lie. I transferred to the household guard 5 years ago. 3 years ago I was assigned, at the request of Princess Alara herself, to the close protection of her children, and I have walked half a step behind Prince Torin more mornings than I have walked behind anyone else alive, including my own wife, who has long since stopped waiting up for me on the nights a state occasion runs late, and who says, whenever I try to apologize for it, that she married a guardsman and not a clock puncher, and knew what she was choosing. Torin and I did not become easy with each other overnight. He was 8 when I was first assigned to him, old enough to notice that a new, quiet man had begun appearing at the edges of every room he entered, and young enough to find that unsettling rather than reassuring, the way children sometimes do before they understand that a fixture in the background can be a kindness rather than a cage. For the better part of that first month, he treated me the way he might have treated a piece of furniture that had been moved somewhere inconvenient, polite, careful to walk around me, never quite looking at me directly. What changed it, as much as anything did, was a public engagement that autumn, a charity fair some 2 hours from Harrogate, crowded and noisy in the way those events always are, where Torin slipped away from his mother's side for no longer than it takes to tie a shoe and found himself, in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, entirely lost among strangers 3 times his height. I found him before anyone else did, tucked behind a refreshment tent with his knees drawn up and his face doing its very best not to cry in front of people he didn't know. And I did not scoop him up or make a fuss of it, because I had already learned enough about him in that first quiet month to know that a fuss was the last thing he wanted. I crouched down instead at his level and asked him, in the same even voice I'd have used to report a change of watch, whether he'd like to walk back together or wait a moment first. He chose to wait a moment first. We waited perhaps 2 minutes in silence before he stood up on his own and said he was ready, and neither of us ever spoke of it again in front of anyone else. But something in the way he looked at me changed after that afternoon, from the wary politeness of a boy tolerating a stranger to something closer to trust, and it has held steady in the 3 years since, through lessons, through official appearances he'd rather not have made, through the ordinary small griefs of growing up in a household where very little about his life is entirely private. I mention this because it matters to what came later. A guard who has not earned a child's trust cannot be told the things Torin eventually told me, on the low wall outside the stables, about a man in a gray coat and an envelope thick enough to notice. And a guard who does not already understand, in his bones, how rarely that particular boy invents trouble where none exists cannot be expected to weigh a sentence like, "I don't want to go," at its proper worth, rather than dismissing it as an ordinary child's ordinary reluctance toward an ordinary doctor's visit. Everything that followed rested, in some part, on 2 minutes behind a refreshment tent 3 years before any of it began. Torin is not, by nature, a boy who invites worry. He is quiet in the way some eldest children are quiet, watchful in a household where watching is often safer than speaking, and dutiful past what most 11-year-olds would tolerate without complaint. He collects maps, real ones, old ones, the kind with sea monsters drawn in the corners where the cartographer ran out of ocean to chart. And it was that habit, more than any misbehavior, that put him in the palace's old map room 2 days before the morning I stood outside that consulting room door. I should say plainly, before I go any further, that checking things I had no particular reason to doubt was not a new habit I discovered that week. It was simply the only way I knew how to do the job, and it had already, more than once, turned up something worth finding before it became something worth regretting. I think of a morning the previous spring, 8 months or so before any of this, when a piano tuner arrived at the side door of the nursery wing to service the old upright in the schoolroom, sent, according to his own letter of introduction, by the firm that had serviced every instrument in the palace for 11 years running. He had the firm's letterhead, a toolbox that looked properly worn, and an easy, unremarkable manner that would have satisfied most men on a busy morning with a dozen other things to attend to. It did not satisfy me, not because anything about him seemed obviously wrong, but because it was my habit, whenever a new face was scheduled anywhere near the children, to telephone the sponsoring firm directly and confirm the appointment before the man ever reached the door. A 2-minute call that had, up to that point, never once turned up anything but a confirmed booking and a slightly puzzled receptionist wondering why I'd bothered asking. That morning, the receptionist was not puzzled. She was alarmed. The firm had no tuner scheduled at the palace that week at all, and the name on the letterhead belonged to a man who had left their employ the previous autumn. It turned out, once Captain Ashcombe and the steward's office looked into it properly, to be nothing so sinister as I feared in the 2 or 3 unpleasant minutes between that phone call and the man's actual arrival at the gate. Not an intruder with any design on the children at all, but a freelance photographer who had once worked the tuning trade as a young man and thought, wrongly, that an old cover story and a toolbox would buy him 20 unsupervised minutes near enough to Prince Bram's schoolroom to get a candid photograph worth selling to a magazine. He was turned away at the gate before he set foot past it, embarrassed and indignant in roughly equal measure, and nothing came of it beyond a firmer instruction to the gatehouse about verifying tradesmen's letters going forward. No child was ever in the same room as him. No harm was done that anyone could point to. But I have never forgotten how close a 2-minute phone call came to being a phone call I didn't bother making, because everything about that morning had looked ordinary enough not to need it. Princess Ilara, when she heard the full account afterward, was the one who first started calling me overcautious with something like fondness in her voice rather than complaint, and it was not long after that she asked, specifically, that I be the one assigned to Torrens' close protection rather than rotated through the general household detail the way most guards are. I tell you this now not to make myself out to be some tireless watchman who suspects every stranger who crosses the gate. I don't. And a man who did would be exhausting to work alongside and worse than useless besides, jumping at every ordinary visitor until no one trusted his judgment on the days it actually mattered. I tell you this because when people ask me afterward how I came to catch what I caught in the affair of the false Dr. Renshaw, they sometimes want the answer to be a flash of brilliance, a detective's sudden intuition, and the honest answer is duller and, I think, more useful than that. It was the same 2-minute habit I'd been keeping for years, applied on an ordinary Tuesday to a name that happened, this time, to matter a very great deal more than a piano tuner's letterhead ever had. The map room sits at the end of an unused gallery in the older wing of Harrogate, a room the household stopped using for anything but storage a generation ago, full of glass-fronted cases and rolled charts nobody has needed since Eldermore stopped drawing its own coastlines by hand. Torren had a standing, informal permission to go there when his lessons were done, provided he told someone first. On the afternoon in question, he told a footman who told nobody else, because nobody thought it worth telling. He found the room already occupied. He described it to me that evening, sitting on the low wall outside the stables where he liked to go when he wanted to think without being watched thinking, in the flat, careful voice he used when he wasn't sure whether what he'd seen was important or nothing at all. He said Queen Consort Morwenna had been standing near the far case with a man Torren had never seen before. Not staff, not a guest he recognized from any guest list a boy his age would have reason to know. A man in a plain gray coat who did not have the bearing of anyone who belonged in that gallery. Torren said the man had handed her a folded paper, and she had given him something in return, an envelope, thick enough that Torren remembered noticing its thickness. and that neither of them had seen him at first, because he'd come in through the service door at the far end, the one nobody used, the one that happened to be closer to the stables. "She saw me before he left," Torin told me. "She didn't say anything about it. She just asked if I'd had a good afternoon and told me the light in there was bad for reading and I should go and find better light." He picked at the seam of his sleeve, not looking at me. "I told Malin about it at supper, just that it was funny, a man in a gray coat with an envelope, like something out of one of the maps. I didn't think it mattered." I did not think that first evening that it mattered either, not in the way it came to matter. I filed it the way I filed most things a child told me, carefully, without alarm, the way you'd note a change in weather that might or might not turn into anything worth an umbrella. What I noticed, and what I did think worth noting, was that Torin had not slept well in the 2 nights since. He was tired in a way that showed at the corners of his eyes rather than in anything he said. The tiredness of a boy replaying something small and stupid in his head at 3 in the morning. Worried he'd done wrong simply by watching a thing he didn't understand and mentioning it at the supper table. I told him it sounded like nothing at all, a household matter, grown-up business, nothing that concerned him, and mostly I believed it myself. I did not yet know the name Sedgwick. I did not yet know what the envelope contained, or what it cost the Queen Consort to have it delivered quietly, through a service door, by a man in a plain coat who left without signing the visitor's log at the gatehouse, the way every other guest to Harrogate is required to sign it. I would learn all of that later, and slowly, the way you learn most things worth learning, not in one clean reveal but in a dozen small ones, each meaning very little on its own. What happened the following evening was the thing that made me stop filing and start checking. We were at the family's private supper, a small gathering, the kind held 3 or 4 evenings a week when there was no state occasion to dress for. King Alaric at the head of the table with Queen Consort Morwenna beside him, Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara across from them. The children permitted to stay for the first course before being taken up by their nurse. I stood my usual post near the sideboard, close enough to hear everything. Invisible in the particular way a household guard learns to be invisible, which is not the same as being absent. Queen Consort Morwenna set down her fork with the small, deliberate click she used when she wanted a room's attention without raising her voice for it. "Alaric," she said, "I've been meaning to mention Torin's cough, the one that lingered after his cold last month. I don't think it's fully gone, and he hasn't been sleeping well, have you, darling?" Torin, halfway through a mouthful of bread, went very still and said nothing, which was answer enough for a table that wasn't looking closely. "I hadn't noticed," Princess Alara said, setting down her own glass, a small frown already forming. "Torin, is that true?" "I'm fine," Torin said, in the automatic way children say it when the alternative is a conversation they don't want to have in front of everyone. "Children his age hide things," Morwenna said gently, to the table at large, in the tone of someone offering wisdom rather than pressing a point. "It's nothing alarming, I'm sure, but I'd rather we were careful than sorry. I took the liberty of making some inquiries. There's a specialist in respiratory conditions in children, very well regarded, currently in Wrenhaven for a conference, a Dr. Renshaw. I managed to secure him for tomorrow morning before he leaves the capital again. It seemed better to catch him while he's near than to wait weeks for an ordinary referral." Crown Prince Rowan set down his own fork more slowly than his stepmother had set down hers. "Tomorrow morning," he repeated. "That's rather sudden, isn't it? Dr. Wexley's seen him twice this year already and never said anything about his lungs." "Dr. Wexley is an excellent family physician," Morwenna said, with the faint, patient smile she wore when she wanted to be agreeable while getting exactly her way. "But he isn't a specialist, and I'd rather not wait on a general practitioner's schedule when a proper one happens to be available. I only want to be sure." Surely no one objects to being sure. Nobody, put that way, could object without sounding as though they preferred uncertainty to their son's health, and Morwenna knew it. I'd watched her build sentences like that before, sentences constructed so that disagreement cost more than agreement, regardless of what agreement actually committed you to. King Alaric, who trusted his wife's judgment in domestic matters as a rule and had a council session at 9 that would occupy the whole of his attention besides, said only, "Of course. See that it's arranged properly through Wexley's office, so there's a record of it." Naturally, Morwenna said, and did not, I would later confirm, do anything of the sort. Rowan looked at his son for a long moment. Torin looked back at him with the particular blankness of a boy trying very hard not to look like he was hiding something, which is its own kind of tell if you know to watch for it, and I did. "Tomorrow morning, then," Rowan said slowly. "Where?" "The consulting room in the nursery wing. I thought quieter for him than the main surgery, less fuss," Morwenna said. 10 o'clock. I'll see to everything." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, standing by the sideboard with my hands clasped behind my back, and my face arranged into the particular nothing a guard's face is trained to hold. I did not feel certainty. I felt the small, specific unease of a man whose job for 6 years had been noticing when paperwork moved faster than paperwork should move, and this had all the shape of paperwork moving too fast, a specialist secured overnight, a location chosen for its quiet rather than its equipment, an instruction to arrange things through Wexley's office that I already suspected, correctly as it turned out, would never actually pass through that office at all. I did not say anything at supper. That is not what a guard does, and it would have accomplished nothing beyond making myself a talking point instead of a watcher. What I did, once the family had risen and the children had gone up with their nurse, was find a quiet minute with Dr. Aubrey Wexley, who happened to be at the palace that evening finishing a note in Prince Bram's chart after a routine visit, and ask him, as casually as I could manage, whether he knew a Dr. Renshaw. Wexley was a heavy-set, unhurried man in his 60s who had tended the royal children since Rowan himself was a boy, and he had the particular kind of memory that unhurried men often have, not fast but thorough, the kind that produces an answer 20 seconds after you've stopped expecting one. He frowned at his own pen for a moment and then said, "Renshaw. There was a Renshaw who lectured at my college years ago now, must be 15 years more. Thaddeus Renshaw. Respiratory specialist, quite well known in his day. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," I said, which was not true, and filed the name away, Thaddeus, the way I'd once filed a mismatched shipping date on a supply manifest that turned out, 3 weeks later, to matter a great deal. I did not know yet that it would matter. I only knew that Dr. Aubrey Wexley, who had practiced medicine in this kingdom for 30 years, had reached for the name of an elderly lecturer from a decade and a half past, and not for a younger colleague currently active enough to be lecturing at a conference in Wrenhaven that same week. That gap between the man Wexley remembered and the man who was supposedly arriving at 10 o'clock the next morning was small enough to be nothing, and large enough that I did not sleep especially well myself that night. I want to be clear that I did not, at that point, suspect anything so serious as what I would eventually find. I suspected sloppiness, or vanity, or a queen consort who liked solving problems herself and cutting corners nobody would ever check. It would have been easy enough, comfortable, even to let it go at that, to trust that a woman married to the King of Eldermore for 11 years had, at minimum, secured a real doctor, whatever else might be said of her methods or her motives. I have thought about it since, about how easy it would have been to let a small, correctable unease dissolve overnight into nothing, the way most small unease does. I did not let it dissolve. I want to tell you that this was some great instinct, some flash of certainty, and it would make a better story if it were. It wasn't. It was habit. 6 years of checking things twice does not leave a man when he changes uniforms. And the habit, that night, was simply to walk down to the gatehouse before I went off duty and ask to see the visitor's log for the following morning, the way I checked every log for every visitor scheduled anywhere near the children, every single day, whether or not anything about the day had given me reason to. What I found there was the first thing that turned unease into something closer to certainty, and it is where the 2 days properly begin. The gatehouse at Harrogate keeps a bound log of every visitor cleared to enter the household proper, separate from the general public register. A second book, kept by the steward's office, for anyone granted access to the family's private wings. Every name in it carries a sponsor, the office or person who vouched for the visit and accepted responsibility for it. Medical visits to the children, by long-standing rule, are sponsored by Dr. Wexley's office and countersigned by the household steward, with 48 hours' notice unless a physician judges the matter urgent, in which case the urgency itself is recorded in writing, signed, and dated. It is not a rule anyone had ever needed to invoke against a member of the family before. It existed the way most rules like it exist, quietly, until the day it doesn't. I asked the night porter, a steady old fellow named Wick who had manned that desk for longer than I'd been alive, to let me see the book for the following morning. He found the entry easily enough. Dr. C. Renshaw, physician, and a Miss E. Prosser, attending nurse, cleared for entry at 9:45, consulting room, nursery wing. Sponsor, Her Majesty the Queen Consort's private office. Not Wexley's office, not the steward's countersignature. The Queen Consort's own private office, which had no standing authority under the household rule to sponsor a medical visit to the children at all. A technicality nobody would likely have noticed, because nobody expected to need to notice it, because who questions the Queen Consort's own office arranging her step-grandson's doctor's appointment? Nobody, that is, except a man whose entire prior career had been built on the specific, unglamorous suspicion that the technicality nobody expects to need to check is exactly the one worth checking. I asked Wick, on a hunch I could not have explained to him if he'd asked, whether a Mr. Sedgwick, I didn't have the name yet, only the description, but I described the plain gray coat and gave an approximate age, had come through the gate 2 days prior. Wick flipped back through the log without much interest and found nothing. No Sedgwick, no gray coat, no entry for that day matching a private visitor to the family wing at all. Might have come through the garden gate, Wick offered. South wall's got the one door that doesn't run through me, goes straight to the old gallery. Groundskeeper's supposed to log anyone who uses it, but I couldn't tell you how often he remembers. I thanked him and did not sleep much that night, not because I had proof of anything, I hadn't, but because I now had 2 small irregularities that happened to rhyme with each other. A man who'd entered the private wing without being logged, 2 days before a doctor's visit that had also, in its own way, entered without being properly logged. I am not a man who believes 2 coincidences make a pattern. I am a man who believes 2 coincidences are worth 1 more phone call before you decide whether they're coincidences at all. Before I left the gatehouse that night, I asked Wick one more thing, whether the household had a standing arrangement with any nursing agency for occasions when the family required an attending nurse alongside a visiting physician, the sort of routine pairing that seemed, on its face, unremarkable enough that I nearly didn't bother asking it at all. Wick didn't know offhand, but he found, tucked in the back of the same ledger, a short list the steward's office kept of 3 approved agencies the household had used over the years, each with a small, neat annotation beside it noting the last date they'd supplied staff to Harrogate. I copied the 3 names into my own notebook without any clear idea, that night, of what I meant to do with them, only the same stubborn instinct that had sent me to look at the visitor's log in the first place. The sense that a name worth checking was a name worth checking twice, in every direction it could be checked. It was nearly midnight by the time I finished, and I very nearly did not go the extra step of telephoning any of the 3 agencies before morning, reasoning that a nurse's credentials mattered a good deal less than a physician's, that Miss Prosser was, in this whole affair, a supporting figure rather than the one whose name and reputation had been borrowed. But a supporting figure is still a figure, and I had learned long before that night that the small, unglamorous details people assume don't matter are very often exactly the ones nobody else has bothered to check. I placed one call before I finally went off duty, to the agency whose annotation showed the most recent use, and reached only a night answering service that promised someone would return my call in the morning. I did not think much of it at the time. I only wrote the hour of the call in my notebook, the way I wrote everything else, and went home to a house where my wife had, as she'd warned me she would, long since stopped waiting up. I never did receive a call back from that agency before the whole affair resolved itself the following morning by other means entirely, and I have often wondered since what they would have told me if I had, whether Miss Prosser's name would have meant anything to them at all, or whether, like Cash and Renshaw, it existed nowhere but on a fabricated letter, and in the confident, well-rehearsed manner of a woman playing a part she had clearly played before. I did not need the answer in the end to see the affair through to its close. But I include the attempt here because it is part of the truth of those 2 days, and because it would be dishonest to make the record sound tidier than it actually was. A great deal of what I did in that stretch of time led nowhere at all, or led somewhere too slowly to matter, and the parts that worked were not more clever than the parts that didn't. They were simply the parts I happened to reach in time. The next morning, the first of what I've been calling the 2 days, though by then it was really the second, I went to Captain Ashcombe before my shift properly began. Halden Ashcombe had commanded the household guard for 9 years and had a soldier's respect for evidence and a courtier's respect for rank, and in my experience the two didn't always pull in the same direction. I told him what I had. The gap between Wexley's memory of an elderly lecturer and a supposedly active specialist arriving with a day's notice, the sponsor line that bypassed the medical office, the unlogged visitor 2 days before. He heard me out fully, which I credit him for. Some men in his position would have stopped me after the first sentence. When I finished, he rubbed a thumb along his jaw and said, "That's 3 loose threads, Hale, not a rope. Doctors get remembered wrong. Queen Consort's office sponsoring a family appointment isn't a crime, it's a shortcut, and I'd wager she's taken it before without anyone blinking. And a visitor coming through the garden gate unlogged is the groundskeeper's failing, not evidence of a conspiracy." "I'm not calling it a conspiracy," I said. "I'm calling it worth 1 telephone call to the college before 10 o'clock tomorrow. If I'm wrong, it costs us a wasted call and I look overcautious, which I can live with. And if you're right, then it costs us a great deal more not to have made it." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Make your call, quietly. If you turn up nothing, this stays between us and nobody's the wiser. If you turn up something, you bring it to me before you bring it to anybody else, not the crown prince, not the king, me. I'll take it from there through the proper channel, and we do this correctly, or we don't do it at all. Are we understood?" I told him we were, and I meant it, and it is worth saying plainly here that everything I did over the following day and a half, I did inside that agreement, not outside it. I did not go looking for a fight. I went looking for a fact. The Royal College of Physicians of Eldermore keeps its registry office in Wrenhaven, a 2-hour drive from Harrogate, and its clerks, in my limited experience of institutions like it, are decent people asked to do a great deal of paperwork with not quite enough time to do it carefully. I telephoned that afternoon and was put through, after some transferring, to a young clerk who sounded as though he'd rather have been anywhere else. "Renshaw," he repeated, and I heard pages turning, quick and inattentive. "Yes, Renshaw, here it is. Registered in good standing, that the one you're after?" "Cash and Renshaw," I said, "a specialist in childhood respiratory conditions." "It says Renshaw," the clerk said, a little defensively, as though I'd accused him of something. "RENSHAW registration's active. That's all I can tell you without the full file in front of me, and the registrar who keeps those is out until Thursday." I asked him to read me the first name on the entry, and there was a pause and the sound of a finger running down a page, and he said, "Doesn't say, just initial. T. Renshaw." T. Renshaw. I want to describe honestly what I felt hearing that, because it would be tidier to say I knew instantly, and I didn't. What I felt was the particular, uncomfortable slackening of a man who has been braced for bad news and is handed something that sounds, on its face, like good news instead. Renshaw is registered. Renshaw is real. Perhaps I have simply been careless with names, and Wexley misremembered a first name from 15 years ago, and a queen consort has, after all, only hired a real physician a little abruptly. For about 4 hours that afternoon, I believed I might have been chasing nothing. I told Captain Ashcombe as much, and he told me, not unkindly, that it happened to every good investigator eventually. You go looking hard enough for a wrong thread, and sometimes there simply isn't one, and the honest thing to do is admit it and stand down. I very nearly did. What kept me from standing down entirely was not suspicion so much as thoroughness, the same stubborn, unglamorous habit that had sent me to the gatehouse in the first place. A first initial of T was not the same as a confirmed match to a first name of Cashin, and I did not like leaving a gap that size unclosed when closing it cost nothing but one more conversation. So that evening, rather than let the matter rest on a rushed clerk's reading of a page, I went back to Dr. Wexley and asked him, plainly this time, whether he happened to remember Thaddeus Renshaw's current situation, whether the man he'd once heard lecture was still practicing, and where. Wexley did not know offhand, but he was curious enough by then and fond enough of Torrin to say he'd ask around discreetly among colleagues who might know. "I trained under men who trained under him," he said. "Give me until morning." On my way back from that second conversation with Wexley, I passed through the small anteroom outside the Queen Consort's private office and found Miss Aldous, her senior lady's attendant, gathering up the evening's correspondence with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had worked in that household a great deal longer than I had. She was not, in my experience, an unkind woman, only a careful one, loyal to her employer in the unquestioning way senior staff often are after enough years of service, and she looked up when I passed with the particular attentiveness of someone who notices everything that moves through a corridor she considers her own. "You've been asking Dr. Wexley a great many questions this evening, Sergeant," she said, not unpleasantly, though not warmly either. "About tomorrow's specialist, I gather." I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that it was simply my habit to confirm the particulars of anyone scheduled near the children, the same as I would for any visitor, and that I meant nothing more by it than ordinary thoroughness. It was not, strictly, a lie, though it was a good deal less than the whole truth, and I have wondered since whether my face gave away more of that gap than my voice did. Miss Aldous studied me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read, not suspicion exactly, but something adjacent to it, the wariness of a woman deciding whether a thing was worth mentioning to someone above her, and then she simply nodded and returned to her correspondence, and I continued on my way, telling myself it was nothing. I have never been able to establish, in the time since, whether that brief exchange in the anteroom found its way to Queen Consort Morwenna before the following morning, or whether the note that pulled me to the east gate at 3 minutes to 10 was, as the steward believed, nothing more than an ordinary reshuffling of an ordinary chaotic morning. Captain Ashcombe has told me, when I've raised it with him since, that he doubts a woman as composed as Morwenna would have tipped her hand so plainly over a guard's routine questions to a family physician, that there were simpler, more mundane explanations for a reassignment on a morning when 2 delegations happened to arrive early at once. He may well be right. But I have carried, since that evening, the small, ordinary discomfort of not knowing for certain whether my own thoroughness that night was entirely invisible, or whether it was the first thread that nearly unraveled the whole quiet architecture of what I was trying to do before I'd finished building it. It is, I think, a discomfort worth carrying. A man who assumes his own carefulness is undetectable has usually stopped being careful enough. That was the end of the first day. I want to pause here and tell you what the household looked like from the outside that evening, because from the outside it looked like nothing at all. A family at supper, a boy tired from bad sleep, a doctor's appointment arranged out of an abundance of caution, exactly the ordinary, forgettable evening it was designed to look like. Only I knew that underneath it sat a first initial that didn't match a face nobody had properly confirmed. An unlogged man in a gray coat, and a queen consort who had, for reasons I still did not understand, chosen to arrange her step-grandson's medical care through her own office rather than the one built for the purpose. I spent part of that evening, before my shift ended, sitting with Torin again, this time in the small sitting room off the nursery rather than out by the stables, because it had started to rain, and because I did not want him alone with his own thoughts if I could help it. He was building something out of wooden blocks with his younger brother, Bram, half his attention on the tower and half somewhere else entirely. "Is it because of what I said?" he asked me, not looking up from the blocks when Bram had wandered off toward his nurse. "The doctor coming tomorrow. Is it because I told Malin about the map room?" I told him, as steadily as I could, that grown-ups arranged doctor's visits for a great many reasons that had nothing to do with anything an 11-year-old boy said at supper, and that whatever the reason, it wasn't his to carry. I believed the first half of that sentence completely. I was less sure, even then, of the second. "I don't want to go," he said, very quietly, still not looking at me. "I don't know why, I just don't." I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count since. A boy who is rarely afraid of anything ordinary, not injections, not the dentist, not the loud fireworks at the king's birthday that sent his younger brother running for cover, telling me, without being able to say why, that he did not want to walk into a room the following morning. Children are not always right about the things that frighten them. But they are not always wrong either. And a man who has spent 6 years learning to notice discrepancies on paper ought to know better than to ignore one sitting in front of him in the shape of a child's plain, unembellished dread. "If anything in that room feels wrong tomorrow," I told him, "you look at me. I'll be right outside the door, and I promise you, I am not going anywhere." It was, I think now, the truest promise I made in the whole affair, and very nearly the hardest one to keep. I learned only much later that Rowan had gone in to see his son himself that same night, well after the household had gone quiet, and sat on the edge of Torin's bed for a while without saying very much of anything at all. He told me, when he finally told me of it, that he hadn't gone in with any particular suspicion of the appointment his stepmother had arranged, that his unease at supper had been, in his own telling, no more than an ordinary father's mild irritation at being informed of a decision rather than consulted on it. He'd gone in simply because Torin had seemed quiet all evening, quieter than his usual quiet, and a father who has learned to read that particular silence does not always need a reason beyond the silence itself to go and sit with it for a while. He asked Torin, he told me, whether he was worried about the doctor tomorrow, and Torin had said only that he didn't like doctors much, which was true enough on its own terms to end the conversation without either of them having to go further than that. Rowan had not pressed him. He told me afterward that he'd wondered, once or twice in the days since, whether pressing that night might have drawn the whole truth out of his son 12 hours sooner than it eventually came, and I have told him, and meant it, that I don't believe it would have. Torin had already decided by then that the man in the gray coat was not his to tell anyone else about, and a father's gentle question at bedtime is rarely enough to undo a boy's own private verdict on what is and isn't safe to say. What I think that quiet, inconclusive visit did do, whether Rowan realized it at the time or not, was plant the same low unease in him that I was carrying myself by then, unspoken and unexamined, the kind that doesn't announce itself as suspicion so much as a mild, persistent wrongness that sits at the back of a man's mind until something else gives it a name. It was that same unease, I believe, that stood behind his fisherman and tied small talk the following morning, glancing at the clock, unable to say what precisely was bothering him and unwilling to abandon a charity delegation on the strength of a feeling he couldn't yet justify. Neither of us knew, that first night, that we were carrying the same weight from two entirely different directions. We would not compare notes on it until it was already over. Dr. Wexley found me before I'd finished my breakfast the following morning, the morning of the appointment itself, looking like a man who had slept even less than I had. He'd telephoned a former colleague the night before, a physician who had trained at the same college as Thaddeus Renshaw, and kept up with him over the years the way old classmates sometimes do, exchanging a letter or two a year long after their working lives diverged. Thaddeus Renshaw is 78 years old, Wexley told me, keeping his voice low though we stood alone in the passage outside the kitchens. He hasn't held regular hospital privileges in 3 years. He had a hip replaced last winter, and by my colleague's account, he gets around now mostly with a cane and mostly no farther than his own garden. He lives in Fenwick-on-Sea, has done for a decade since he retired from the college. My colleague wrote to him at Christmas and had a reply in January, in Renshaw's own hand, complaining about the weather and his hip in equal measure. He is not, Wexley said, with the particular flatness of a careful man delivering a conclusion he does not enjoy reaching, a man attending a medical conference in Wrenhaven this week. He is not a man who could plausibly arrive at Harrogate by 10 o'clock this morning, even if he wished to. And my colleague has never, in 30 years of correspondence, heard him mention a son, a nephew, a junior partner, or anyone at all who shares his name and might reasonably use it. I asked him whether he was certain, because a thing like this deserved to be asked plainly rather than assumed, and Wexley said, "I telephoned my colleague again not 20 minutes ago and asked him to telephone Renshaw's own housekeeper directly, to be sure the old man hadn't had some late change of plans nobody had told us about. He rang me back 8 minutes ago." Thaddeus Renshaw took his tea on his own terrace in Fenwick-on-Sea this morning, same as every morning, and has no notion that anyone in Eldermore is currently borrowing his name. There it was, not a suspicion any longer, not a gap in a story that could still be explained by carelessness or coincidence, but a fact, checked twice, by two men independently, converging on the same plain conclusion. The man scheduled to walk into that consulting room at 10 o'clock was not who he claimed to be, and no version of an honest mistake accounted for it. Someone had taken a real name, attached to a real and verifiable registration, and built a false man on top of it, gambling correctly that no one at Harrogate would think to look past the surface of a name that checked out on a hurried telephone call. I did not waste time being satisfied at having been right. I went straight to Captain Ashcombe's office, laid it out for him exactly as Wexley had laid it out for me, and watched a man who had, only the day before, called my 3 loose threads a rope not yet tied, go very still and very serious in the space of about 10 seconds. "You're certain," he said, echoing the same question I'd put to Wexley, because that is what a good officer does before he moves, makes the man in front of him say it plainly one more time. Dr. Wexley spoke to Renshaw's housekeeper's account of his morning not half an hour ago. The real Thaddeus Renshaw is 78, uses a cane, and is in Fenwick-on-Sea. Whoever is downstairs is not him. Ashcombe was already reaching for his jacket. "I'll need to take this to the King's private secretary before I can pull a physician the Queen Consort herself arranged out of a room with the family in it. You understand that, Hale? I can't simply march in and accuse a man in front of the Crown Prince and Princess without the authority to back it, not on a matter like this. It has to be done correctly, or it isn't worth doing at all. Give me the time it takes to reach the private secretary's office and get him to act, and I'll have the standing to end this properly, not just noisily." I understood it, and I understand it better now than I did in that moment, standing there with the clock already reading 9:30. The instinct to simply run down the corridor and stop it myself, on my own authority, was not a small one. But a household guard who seizes a physician with his bare hands on a hunch, however well-founded, in front of the king's own grandson, does more than end one morning's trouble. He hands Queen Consort Morwenna, whatever her actual involvement, a genuine grievance to raise, a real scene to point to, a guard who overstepped and frightened a boy who was frightened quite enough already. Ashcombe was right that it had to be done in a way that would hold up once the doors were open and everyone was looking. That is restraint too, though it rarely feels like it in the moment you're living it. The discipline not to be the loudest thing in the room even when you are certain you are the rightest. "Go," I told him. "I'll hold the corridor." He went, and I held it, and at 9:45 I watched the man calling himself Dr. Renshaw arrive in person for the first time, walking up the nursery wing corridor beside a woman I did not yet know as Miss Prosser, both of them carrying themselves with the unhurried, professional calm of people entirely confident in their own welcome. I studied him the way I studied every stranger who came near the children, without appearing to study him at all, a skill a man either learns in this line of work or fails at it. And I noted, without yet knowing what to make of the noting, that his handshake with the steward's assistant who greeted him was a fraction too firm, the grip of a man who had rehearsed being confident rather than simply being it, the same Tell Dennick would later describe in his manner once the door had closed. I noted that his shoes, though good ones, were newer than the rest of his clothing, suggested a man of his supposed age and standing ought to be wearing. I noted that he glanced, just once, toward the end of the corridor where I stood, with the brief, assessing look of a man taking inventory of who else was in the room, rather than the incurious glance of someone with nothing to account for. None of it, on its own, was proof of anything, and I want to be honest that if Wexley's confirmation had not already reached me by then, I might have written the whole impression off as a guard's overactive suspicion, the same way Ashcombe very nearly had the day before. But it did not feel like nothing, standing there watching him disappear through the consulting room door with Torrin already seated inside. And it is a feeling I have thought back on many times since, the particular, useless frustration of watching a thing you already know to be wrong walk calmly past you because you do not yet have the standing to stop it. What neither Ashcombe nor I accounted for, in that 10 minutes of decision, was that the household had already begun moving pieces of its own that morning, entirely apart from what either of us knew. I learned only afterward, from Alara herself, what had happened to pull her and Rowan away from the nursery wing that morning, at nearly the exact hour their presence there might have mattered most. A delegation from the Coastal Relief Foundation, a charity whose patron Rowan had agreed, months earlier, to become, had arrived at the palace's south entrance a full hour ahead of their scheduled afternoon audience, apparently owing to a misprinted itinerary. It fell to the king's private office to decide who ought to receive them informally until the proper hour, and it was Morwenna, present when the question was raised at the morning's household meeting, who suggested, reasonably, warmly, in a manner that left no graceful way to refuse it, that Rowan and Alara go down and greet them personally rather than leave a delegation of well-meaning coastal fishermen and schoolteachers standing about in a strange palace with nothing to do for an hour. Alara described that meeting to me afterward in more detail than I think she realized she was giving, the way people sometimes do when they are still turning a thing over in their own mind, and find it easier to make sense of out loud. The king's private secretary had raised the misprinted itinerary almost as an aside. She said, a minor scheduling headache to be solved and forgotten, and there had been a brief silence in which no one particularly wanted the job of entertaining strangers for an hour on a morning already crowded with other obligations. It was Morwenna who filled that silence, and filled it well not by volunteering herself, which might have seemed too obviously convenient, but by turning to Rowan with what Alara described as genuine warmth in her voice, and saying that surely he, of everyone in the room, understood better than anyone what it meant to a group of ordinary people to be received personally rather than passed off to an aide, and that she couldn't think of anyone the Foundation would rather meet than its own patron. It wasn't a demand, Alara told me. That's what I keep coming back to. If she'd ordered it, Rowan would have pushed back or at least questioned it. She made it sound like the kindest, most obvious thing in the world to do, and put it in exactly the words that made refusing feel small and ungracious. I've watched her do it 100 times over the years, and I still didn't see it coming that morning because there was nothing to see. It was just a good suggestion, generously offered, at precisely the hour it would do the most damage. Rowan, for his part, told me he hadn't thought twice about accepting it, that a crown prince who begins weighing every gracious suggestion for a hidden motive soon finds himself unable to function in a household at all, and that the whole of his upbringing had trained him to say yes to exactly this kind of small, decent request without hesitation. It is, I think, one of the uncomfortable truths at the center of the whole affair, that Queen Consort Morwenna did not need to lie to arrange what she arranged. She needed only to be, for one carefully chosen quarter of an hour, exactly as thoughtful and reasonable as everyone in that household had spent years learning to expect her to be, and to let that reasonableness do the rest of the work for her. It seemed like exactly the sort of small courtesy Rowan takes seriously, Alara told me later, with the particular bitterness of a mother realizing after the fact how neatly she'd been managed. And it was only an hour. Torrin's doctor's appointment was routine. That's what we'd been told. That's what it was supposed to be. We thought we were doing the considerate thing. I don't believe, even now, that Queen Consort Morwenna manufactured the misprinted itinerary itself. Charities are entirely capable of arriving early without anyone's help. But she moved quickly and gracefully to make use of it the moment it landed in front of her, the way a woman does who has spent years learning to turn small accidents into useful ones. And the result was the same regardless of how much of it she'd planned from the start. At the hour her step-grandson was to be left alone in a consulting room with two strangers, his parents were a floor below, shaking hands with schoolteachers, entirely unaware there was anywhere else they ought to be. Rowan told me afterward that he'd felt it the whole time he stood there smiling and asking a fisherman polite questions about the tides, a low, persistent wrongness he couldn't attach to anything specific, the kind a father sometimes feels and talks himself out of because there is no evidence attached to it, only a feeling, and a grown man in his position is not meant to abandon a charity delegation on the strength of a feeling. He kept glancing at the clock on the far wall. At 9:58, by his own account, he leaned over to Alara and said only, "Something's wrong," and she said, "I know," because she'd been thinking the same thing and hadn't said it either, each of them waiting for the other to be the one to admit it first. I did not know any of that yet, standing in the corridor outside the nursery wing with Captain Ashcombe already striding away toward the private secretary's office. What I knew was that it was 9:50, that the appointment was set for 10, and that I intended to be exactly where I was when the hour came, whatever anyone had told me about waiting at the end of the hall. What happened instead, at 3 minutes to 10, was that the household steward, Mr. Pryor, found me in that corridor with an apologetic look already arranged on his face and a folded note in his hand. "Sergeant Hale," he said, "I've had word from the Queen Consort's office. You're wanted at the East Gate, the trade delegations arriving early as well. It seems everyone's schedule has gone sideways this morning, and they're short a man on the perimeter. I'm to see you reassigned there for the morning." I did not, in that moment, know whether Morwenna had somehow learned of my inquiries, whether a nervous clerk at the college had mentioned my call to someone who mentioned it further, or whether Pryor's note was exactly what it appeared to be, an ordinary reshuffling of an ordinary morning gone slightly chaotic. I have never fully settled that question, and I'm not sure it matters now. What mattered, standing there with Pryor waiting for my answer, was that I had been given a direct instruction, through the proper channel, from an office with every right to give it, and that ignoring it outright, walking past Pryor and planting myself outside that door regardless, was exactly the kind of unauthorized, dramatic overstep Ashcombe had just spent 10 minutes warning me against. So I did not ignore it. I told Pryor I understood, and I asked him, as steadily as I could manage, for one favor before I went. 5 minutes to find Dennick Farr, a fellow guardsman I trusted as much as I trusted my own judgment, and hand the nursery wing corridor to him in my place, so that it was never, for even a minute, left unwatched by someone who knew what to watch for. Pryor, who had no reason to object to a guard covering his own post sensibly before reassignment, agreed. I found Dennick in the guardroom 2 minutes later, told him in 4 short sentences everything he needed to know: the false name, the real Renshaw and Fenwick-on-Sea, the consulting room, the 10 o'clock hour, Ashcombe already gone to the private secretary, and watched his face change the way mine must have changed the morning before, from ordinary duty into something else. "Go," he said, "I'll hold the door. Nobody goes in or out without me seeing it." I went to the east gate as ordered and stood my new post with my collar straight and my eyes forward, and if anyone had looked closely at my hands they would have seen they were not quite steady, because I had just walked away from the one door in the palace I most needed to be standing in front of, on the strength of a note and a chain of command I had promised to respect. I told myself Dennick would hold it. I told myself Ashcombe would move fast. I told myself 10 o'clock was still 3 minutes away, and a great deal could still happen in 3 minutes. I did not yet know how much. I learned what happened inside that consulting room in the minutes after 10 o'clock the way I learned most of the rest of it afterward, pieced together from people who had been there, and were willing, once it was safely over, to tell me. Dennick gave me his account that same evening, in the flat, careful manner of a man reporting exactly what he saw and no more, the way good guards learn to report. He said the man calling himself Dr. Renshaw had a case of instruments that looked, to Dennick's eye, almost too new, the leather still stiff at the corners. The kind of case a man buys once and uses for 30 years, not the worn, softened kind an actual 30-year physician carries. He said the man's manner was pleasant enough, unhurried, practiced in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed being pleasant rather than simply being it. And he said that for the first several minutes, nothing at all happened that would have alarmed anyone standing where Dennick stood: a friendly greeting to Torrin, a comment about the weather, Miss Prosser laying out a blood pressure cuff, and a stethoscope with the ordinary clatter of ordinary equipment. It was the questions that changed things, Dennick said. Not the medical ones, those came first. Ordinary enough: have you been coughing? Does your chest feel tight? Are you sleeping? And Torrin answered them the short, careful way boys his age answer questions from strangers they don't want to disappoint. But then, in the same unhurried tone, without any change in pace that would have alerted someone not listening as closely as Dennick was listening, the man had asked, "And is anything on your mind lately?" Sometimes when boys don't sleep well, it's not their chest at all, it's something they saw or heard that they haven't quite worked out how to think about. Nothing troubling like that recently. Dennick told me he'd felt the hair go up on the back of his neck at that, standing just outside the half-open door, because there was no version of a respiratory examination that required a physician to ask an 11-year-old boy whether he'd seen anything troubling lately, and because the question had landed close enough to the map room and the man in the gray coat that it could not, in Dennick's judgment, have been an accident. He said Torrin had gone very still, the same stillness I'd have recognized instantly, the stillness of a boy deciding whether telling the truth was safe, and had answered carefully, "No, sir," in a voice Dennick described as not quite steady. That was when I put my head properly through the door, Dennick told me. Not far, just enough to be seen. I said His Royal Highness's parents would likely want to be present for the rest of the examination, and did they know when they were expected back? It wasn't much, but it slowed things down, and slowing things down was all I had. It was, I think, exactly the right instinct, not a confrontation, which Dennick had no authority and no proof yet to mount, but a small, procedural interruption, the kind that costs nothing and buys a minute, delivered by a guard who understood, the same as I did, that the discipline of the job is very often just this: finding the smallest lawful thing you can do to slow a bad moment down until someone with more authority or more proof can arrive to stop it properly. The man calling himself Renshaw had not liked the interruption. Dennick said, though he'd covered it well, a brief, tight smile, an assurance that the family's presence wasn't strictly necessary for a routine check, that it would only take a few more minutes. Miss Prosser had moved, in that pause, to draw the curtain across the room's one window, murmuring something about the light, and it was that small, unnecessary act, darkening a room for an examination that needed no darkness, that Dennick said finally tipped him from uneasy into certain that something in that room was not what it claimed to be. He held his ground in the doorway after that, he told me, present enough to be seen and to slow anything further, careful enough not to overstep an authority he didn't yet have. That is where matters stood, Torrin answering careful half-truths to a stranger's questions, Dennick a watchful obstacle in the doorway, the curtain drawn against a daylight examination that had no need of drawn curtains. When I was standing 300 yards away at the east gate, watching a trade delegation's cars roll up the drive and knowing none of it. What ended it, in the room itself, arrived from a direction none of us had planned for. Rowan told me afterward that he'd made his excuses to the Coastal Relief delegation, with a courtesy that cost him everything he had left to give it, thanking them warmly, promising Alara would return to finish what he could not, and walking, not running, because a crown prince does not run through his own palace in front of foreign visitors and startle a household into thinking something is wrong before he's certain it is. He told me the walk from the south entrance to the nursery wing had never in his life felt so long, and that somewhere in the middle of it he had stopped pretending to himself that he was merely being cautious, and admitted he was afraid. He came around the last corner of the nursery corridor at 10:09, and found Dennick standing half in and half out of the consulting room doorway, and it was the sight of a guard he trusted holding a position rather than standing easy that told Rowan, before a single word was spoken, that his instinct at the charity reception had been the right one all along. "Your Royal Highness," Dennick said, low and urgent, "I don't have proof yet, only Sergeant Hale's suspicions and my own. The man's not asking a doctor's questions, and the young prince hasn't been touched, not yet, but I don't like where it's headed." Rowan did not ask for more explanation than that. He told me later that 9 minutes of walking the length of his own home with dread building in his chest had already done most of the deciding for him, and that Dennick's 4 sentences simply confirmed a thing he already believed. He put his hand flat against the door, not hard, not a shove, and stepped through it. I want to describe what happened next as Rowan described it to me, because I was not there for it myself, and because it is the part of this story that belongs to him rather than to me. The man calling himself Dr. Renshaw had just turned back from the darkened window, stethoscope in hand, and was saying to Torrin in that same unhurried, patient voice, "Now, if you'll just lift your—" when Rowan crossed the room in 4 strides and put himself, quite simply, between his son and the man's outstretched hand. He did not raise his voice. He told me afterward that he'd wanted to, that some old, ungoverned part of him had wanted to shout the room down, and that what stopped him was the sight of Torrin's face, pale, relieved, and still frightened, which told him plainly that the boy needed a father who was steady, not a father who was furious. "That's enough," Rowan said instead, quietly, with his hand raised flat between the physician and his son, not a fist, not a threat, simply an unmoving wall of a hand that made continuing impossible without going through him. "You will not touch him, not until I understand exactly who you are." The man, I still did not at that hour know his real name. Only the false one he'd been using recovered himself quickly, the way men who have practiced this kind of moment tend to. Your Royal Highness, I understand your concern, but I assure you, Her Majesty the Queen Consort personally arranged. I heard you, Rowan said. I'm not asking what my stepmother arranged. I'm asking who you are. And then to Dennick, without turning his head, in the level voice of a man giving an order he has never before had to give in his own home, find Hale, now. It was, Dennick told me, the fastest he had ever run down a palace corridor in 9 years of service, and I was still 300 yards away, watching the last of the trade delegation's cars pull up the drive, entirely unaware that the whole of it had already begun to turn. What I did know, standing at the east gate with my collar straight and my mind 300 yards away in a room I couldn't see, was that Captain Ashcombe's 10 minutes had stretched to nearly 20, and that 20 minutes is a very long time to stand still when you believe, without being able to prove it to the man beside you, that something is going wrong just out of sight. I had almost decided, I will admit this plainly, to abandon my post without leave and walk back regardless of what it cost me, when a young footman came half running down the gravel drive, out of breath, and told me Captain Ashcombe wanted me at the nursery wing immediately, on the King's private secretary's own authority. I did not wait to hear the rest of it. I told the guard beside me to hold the gate, and I walked fast but not running, because a man who arrives at a crisis out of breath and wild-eyed is less used to everyone in the room than a man who arrives steady, and 9 years of training does not abandon you even when your heart is going twice its normal pace, the whole length of the palace back to the nursery wing. Captain Ashcombe met me halfway, moving at nearly the same measured pace, and told me as we walked what had happened on his end. The King's private secretary had been in a meeting when Ashcombe first arrived and could not be pulled from it in under 15 minutes. 15 minutes Ashcombe had spent, he told me, feeling every second of it in his own chest. The moment the secretary was free, Ashcombe had laid out exactly what Wexley and I had given him, the false first name, the real Renshaw's confirmed whereabouts, the housekeeper's account of his morning tea. The secretary, a precise, unhurried man named Faraday, whom I had met perhaps a dozen times in my years of service and never once seen flustered, had not simply taken Ashcombe's word for it, even coming as it did from the captain of the household guard. He'd asked first whether Dr. Wexley would put his name to the account in writing, and whether Wexley's colleague in Wrenhaven could be reached directly by telephone rather than relayed second-hand, because a decision that touched the Queen Consort's own arranged appointment was not one he intended to make on a chain of hearsay, however trustworthy each link in that chain happened to be. Ashcombe told me it was the longest 90 seconds of his morning, standing in that office while Faraday dialed Wexley's colleague himself and asked him, in his own careful words, to confirm what he'd told Wexley not an hour before. The colleague confirmed it without hesitation. Only then, Ashcombe said, had Faraday set down the telephone, written a short line on a card in his own hand, and told Ashcombe that he had the King's standing authority, exercised in the King's name during the King's own council session, to intervene however the situation required. I have thought about that 90 seconds more than once since, because it would have been easy for Faraday to simply trust Ashcombe's word and save the household a few precious minutes it could ill afford to lose that morning. He didn't, and I don't fault him for it. A man in his position who acted on every urgent report without confirming it himself would not have lasted long enough to be trusted with anything urgent at all. And it was that same careful, unhurried insistence on confirming a thing twice before acting on it once that had put me in the corridor with proof in the first place. The whole affair in the end was carried through by a chain of ordinary, cautious men and women each doing the same small, unglamorous thing, checking before believing. And it is no small part of why, when it finally broke open, It broke open cleanly, with nothing left for anyone to dispute afterward. "We're covered," Ashcombe told me, as we came around the final corner. "Whatever happens in that room in the next 5 minutes, we're covered properly, start to finish. Now let's go and finish it." We found the corridor already crowded when we reached it, Dennick just inside the doorway. Alara arrived from the reception downstairs with her face white and her hand already reaching for her son, and Rowan standing exactly where he'd planted himself, his hand no longer raised but his body still squarely between the man and the boy. Torin was off the examination table entirely now, pressed against his mother's side, and the sight of that, the boy safely behind his parents rather than in front of a stranger's instruments, was the first full breath I'd let myself take in over an hour. Torin found my eyes across the room before I'd said a single word, and I saw something in his face shift, not quite surprise, because I think some part of him had been listening for my footsteps the whole time, but relief so plain it was almost startling on a boy who worked as hard as he did to keep his face steady. I had told him the evening before that I would be right outside the door and would not be going anywhere, and I had broken that promise for the better part of an hour through no choice I'd been given, and I remember thinking, even in the middle of everything else happening in that room, that I owed him an apology for it the moment there was time to give one properly. He did not seem to hold it against me. He only mouthed, without any sound at all, the words "you came," and I have never in 11 years of service felt a debt settle so plainly as I did in that half-second. The man calling himself Dr. Renshaw had the look, by the time I reached the door, of someone recalculating very quickly and not liking any of the numbers he was arriving at. He'd found his composure again, I credit him that much. He was better at this than most men would have been, and was saying to Rowan in a voice pitched for reasonableness, "Your Royal Highness, I understand a father's instinct, truly I do, but I have been retained in good faith by Her Majesty the Queen Consort's own office, and I must ask that you allow me to at least conclude a basic." "Dr. Renshaw," I said, stepping into the room past Dennick, and I watched the man's face do the small, involuntary thing a face does when a name lands somewhere it wasn't expecting to be examined rather than simply used. "Thaddeus Renshaw is 78 years old. He had his hip replaced last winter. He took his tea this morning on his own terrace in Fenwick-on-Sea, 200 miles from here, and according to the household that has kept his correspondence for 30 years, he has never once mentioned a son, a nephew, or a colleague who shares his name. I'd like you to tell His Royal Highness which of those two men you are, because you cannot be both." I will not claim the man broke instantly, because he did not. Men who build a scheme this careful rarely collapse at the first true sentence spoken against them, and he tried, for a moment longer, the tone of wounded professional dignity, insisting there had been some clerical confusion, that he had never claimed to be the Thaddeus Renshaw of Fenwick-on-Sea specifically, that the college's own registry, and it was there that Captain Ashcombe, who had come prepared for exactly this kind of half-retreat, produced the single sheet of paper the private secretary's office had faxed through from Wrenhaven not 15 minutes before, the actual registration file, requested under the King's authority rather than a rushed telephone call to a junior clerk, showing one physician answering to the surname Renshaw currently licensed in the Kingdom of Eldermore, first name Thaddeus, status semi-retired, no active hospital privileges, no known associate practicing under the same surname. "There is no Cassian Renshaw in this kingdom's medical registry," Ashcombe said, holding the paper where the man could see it without taking it from his hand. "There never has been. So I'll ask you the same question the sergeant just asked, and I'll ask you to answer it honestly, because the next person to ask it will be a magistrate, and honesty will serve you a great deal better with him than it has with us." It was Miss Prosser, not the man himself, who broke first, a small, sharp intake of breath, and a half-step toward the door that Dennick closed off without so much as raising his voice, simply moving his body into the space she'd meant to use. Her composure went after that almost visibly, the practiced stillness of the past hour cracking into something younger and more frightened than either she or her partner had shown the room until then. And it was in the silence that followed, with her eyes darting toward a man who no longer looked capable of rescuing either of them, that Queen Consort Morwenna arrived in the doorway, drawn, I imagine, by a corridor that had gone from empty to crowded with a crown prince, a captain of the guard, and raised voices in a matter of minutes. She took in the room in a single sweep, her step-grandson safe behind his mother, her stepson's face carved from something colder than she had likely ever seen it carve into before, a physician she had personally arranged standing, exposed with a false registration paper held up in front of him. And I watched her reach, visibly, for the same tone she had used at the supper table 2 nights before, the pleasant, unhurried voice built for ending arguments before they properly started. "I don't understand what's happening here," she said. "I engaged this physician in good faith, on a colleague's recommendation, for Torin's own benefit. If there's been some error with his credentials, I assure you I had no knowledge of it whatsoever." Rowan did not raise his voice either when he answered her, and I have thought since that this was the moment I understood most clearly why the household trusted him the way it did, that he had learned, somewhere along the way, the same lesson his father's guards live by, that the coldest, steadiest response is very often the one that actually lands. "Then you won't mind," he said, "if the king asks you the same questions Captain Ashcombe is about to ask this man, under the same terms." Morwenna did not answer that directly. She looked instead toward the false physician and Miss Prosser, and whatever passed across her face in that half-second calculation, or genuine alarm at how badly her own arrangement had unraveled, or something colder than either, was gone again before I could be certain I'd read it rightly. It would be King Alaric, summoned by his private secretary and arriving not 4 minutes later with a face I had never once seen him wear in 11 years of service, who would ask her those questions properly, in a room without an audience of frightened children in it. And it is not my place to tell you everything that was said in that room, because I was not in it, and because some conversations belong to a family and not to the men who guard its doors. What I can tell you is what happened to the 2 people who had, in fact, walked into Harrogate Palace under false names with forged paperwork, and a case full of instruments they had no license to use on anyone. Palace security took them into custody within the hour, quietly, without a struggle. Either was foolish enough to offer once the room had turned so completely against them, and handed them over to the kingdom's civil authorities before the day was out, on charges I understand were still being sorted out by the magistrate's office weeks later: fraud, impersonation of a licensed physician, and trespass onto crown property under false pretenses among them. I never learned the man's real name. I am not certain even now that Miss Prosser's real name was Prosser either. Mr. Pryor found me later that same afternoon in the guardroom, looking a good deal older than he had at 3 minutes to 10 that morning. He had heard, by then, the whole shape of what his note had nearly cost, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he could bring himself to say anything at all, turning his own hands over as though checking them for some stain that wasn't actually there. "I want you to know I had no notion," he said, finally. "The instruction came through the usual channel, properly signed. Nothing about it looked out of the ordinary. If I'd had the first idea what it would mean, sending you to that gate—" I told him, and meant it, that I did not hold it against him because I didn't. A steward who begins treating every properly signed instruction from the Queen Consort's own office as suspect would not last a season in his post, and would make the household harder to run rather than safer, jumping at shadows the way I'd told myself, more than once in those 2 days, that I could not afford to do either. What had gone wrong that morning was not Pryor's carefulness failing. It was that the household's carefulness had a gap in it precisely where the Queen Consort's own authority was concerned, a gap nobody had thought to close, because nobody had imagined they would ever need to. I told him as much, and told him too that the new rule the king would hand down within the week, every medical appointment through Wexley's office, no exceptions, whoever asked, would close that gap for good, and that he'd done nothing that morning but exactly what his post required of him. He did not look fully convinced, and I understood that too. A man in his position carries a different weight than a guard does. My failures, if I have them, tend to be private and correctable before anyone else ever sees them, while his are written down in a ledger with his own signature beside them. But he thanked me, and I think he meant it more than the words themselves suggested, and we have worked together easily enough in the time since, with an unspoken understanding between us that a note from any office, however senior, is worth a second look before it's acted on without question. The two people who had walked into Harrogate under false names were gone from the palace grounds within the hour, taken quietly through the same service door the man in the gray coat had once used, so that no member of the household staff not already aware of the affair would ever have cause to ask questions about it. I watched them go from the end of the corridor, the false Dr. Renshaw walking with the stiff, overcomposed posture of a man determined to leave with whatever dignity he had left, Miss Prosser beside him with her eyes fixed on the floor. Neither of them looked back toward the consulting room, and I have never learned, and have never particularly wanted to learn, what became of either of them beyond the fraud and trespass charges that occupied the magistrate's office for some weeks afterward. Captain Ashcombe was the one who eventually pieced most of it together for me, some 10 days after the affair itself, over 2 cups of tea gone cold in his office, while he read from notes he'd taken during the household's own quiet inquiry. An inquiry the king had ordered run in parallel with the magistrates, so that the family might understand privately what had happened even where the criminal case would only ever address the narrower question of fraud and trespass. Ashcombe was not a man who enjoyed gossip, and he prefaced everything he told me that afternoon by saying he'd only share it because I'd been the one to unravel the thing in the first place, and had, in his words, earned the right to know how the thread had ended. What I did learn that afternoon, piecing it together the same slow way I'd pieced together everything else, was enough to understand why it had happened at all. The man in the gray coat had a name after all, and it was Sedgwick, a private financial agent, not quite a moneylender by trade, and not quite anything else respectable either, the kind of man who arranges discreet loans for people too proud or too exposed to arrange them through a proper bank. Queen Consort Morwenna, I learned, had borrowed against a piece of her own personal jewelry some years before her marriage to the king, a debt she had quietly continued servicing ever since rather than let it become public, and Sedgwick's visit to the map room had been nothing grander than the final, awkward transaction of that old arrangement. An envelope of payment for a piece of jewelry finally being returned to her outright, the debt at last closed. It was not treason. It was not even, strictly, a crime, a woman's private financial embarrassment, tidied up quietly, the way people have tidied up private embarrassments for as long as there have been debts and reputations to protect. What made it dangerous was not the debt itself, but what she did in the panic of believing it might come out. When word reached her, through a servant who had overheard Torrens' supper-table remark and mentioned it further up the household chain than the boy ever intended, that her step-grandson had witnessed the handover and described it, however innocently, as something worth telling his sister about, Morwenna did not go to Rowan or Ilara and simply explain herself, which would have cost her a moment's embarrassment and nothing more. She went to Sedgwick instead and asked him, in whatever words passed between them, how she might be certain the boy would say no more about it. And Sedgwick, a man for whom problems like this were simply another kind of arrangement to be brokered, offered her a solution built entirely out of his own disreputable contacts. A man willing to play the part of a physician for a fee, skilled enough at gentle, probing conversation to determine exactly how much an 11-year-old boy understood and remembered, and persuasive enough, if needed, to recommend a period of quiet rest away from the household. Away, in practice, from anyone Torin might otherwise have told more. Sedgwick himself was never charged with anything beyond a minor irregularity in how he'd once structured a private loan, a matter the magistrate's office judged unrelated enough to the fraud at the palace to pursue separately, if at all. I confess I found that harder to accept than almost anything else in the affair, that the man who had, in effect, set the whole scheme in motion by offering Morwenna a solution built out of his own disreputable contacts walked away from it with barely a mark against his name, while the two people he'd recruited to carry it out faced the courts alone. Captain Ashcombe told me, when I said as much to him, that this was simply how these things too often resolve themselves in practice. The man who arranges harm from a comfortable distance rarely stands as close to the consequences as the ones he sends to do the arranging. It did not sit easily with me then, and it does not sit entirely easily with me now, though I have made my peace with the parts of an outcome that are not mine to control. I do not believe, even now, that Queen Consort Morwenna set out that morning, intending real harm to her step-grandson. I believe she told herself, the way people telling themselves comfortable lies often do, that it was only a doctor's visit, only an abundance of caution, only a small manipulation in service of a private matter that concerned no one else. But intention is not the same as consequence, and the consequence of what she arranged was a frightened boy alone in a room with two strangers, a curtain drawn against the daylight, and a man asking him careful questions designed to find out what he knew and to make sure, one way or another, that he stopped knowing it out loud. Whatever she told herself she was doing, that is the thing she very nearly did. I was not present for the conversation between King Alaric and his wife that followed, and I will not pretend to know every word of it. Rowan told me only the shape of it, afterward in the careful, guarded way a son speaks about his father's marriage even when he has every right to speak less carefully. The king, he said, had listened to the whole of it, Sedgwick, the debt, the panic, the arrangement made through a fixer's disreputable contacts, without raising his voice once, which Rowan said was somehow worse for her than shouting would have been. There was no public announcement, no scandal permitted to reach beyond the walls that already knew it. Eldermore's crown has never, in my experience, found much wisdom in airing a family's private failures for the pleasure of strangers. But something changed in that room all the same, something Rowan would only describe to me as his father making very plain, in a voice that did not need to be loud to be absolute, that whatever debts or embarrassments his wife carried from her life before their marriage, they were never again to be settled at the expense of his grandchildren's safety, and that the next time her judgment failed a child in this household so completely, there would be no quiet conversation behind closed doors to settle it. I do not know what passed between them beyond that. I know only that Queen Consort Morwenna did not appear at the family's private supper for the better part of a week afterward, and that when she did appear again, she said nothing at all about doctors or specialists or her step-grandson's health, and has not to this day raised the subject once. King Alaric summoned Captain Ashcombe, Dr. Wexley, and myself to his private study 2 days later, along with the household steward, and it was there, over the course of perhaps 20 minutes, that the rule which should have stopped the whole affair before it started was finally written down properly rather than simply assumed. Every medical appointment for any child of the royal household, the king decreed, would from that day forward be arranged exclusively through Dr. Wexley's office, sponsored and countersigned there and nowhere else, regardless of who suggested it or how urgently it was framed. No exceptions made for convenience, for a visiting specialist's limited schedule, for anyone's private office, however senior. The garden gate at the south wall, the one that ran straight to the old gallery without passing the gatehouse, was fitted within the month with its own logbook and its own porter's chair, so that no visitor to Harrowgate would ever again cross onto the grounds unrecorded, whatever door they happened to choose. Dr. Wexley, for his part, was given standing authority to personally verify, by whatever means he judged necessary, the credentials of any specialist brought in from outside. A small, unglamorous power that I suspect he will now exercise for the rest of his career, with considerably more thoroughness than the office ever required of him before. "You were right to check," the king told me, near the end of that meeting, in the plain, unadorned way he had of saying the things he meant most. "I would like it understood, Sergeant Hale, that you are never to feel you need my wife's permission, or anyone else's, to ask a question that keeps my grandchildren safe. That is the whole of your post. Everything else is merely the uniform." I have carried that sentence with me since, more than any medal or commendation the household later saw fit to give me, because it named, more precisely than I could have named it myself, the thing I had actually been doing for 2 days that felt, at the time, like nothing braver than checking a logbook and making a few telephone calls nobody had asked me to make. I went to find Torrin that same afternoon, once the study meeting had ended and the corridors had settled back into their ordinary quiet. I found him in the small sitting room off the nursery again, not building anything this time, just sitting by the window with a book he wasn't reading, and he looked up when I came in with an expression I recognized instantly, because I had worn something close to it myself more than once in my life. The particular, uncertain look of someone waiting to find out whether he is in trouble for a thing he still doesn't fully understand. "Am I going to have to talk to anyone else about it?" he asked before I'd even sat down. "About the map room, about what I saw?" "No," I told him, and meant it completely. "That's finished. You didn't do anything wrong, Torrin, not that afternoon, and not at supper, and not this morning either. You told the truth to people who love you, and grown-ups made choices with that truth that were never yours to carry. That's the whole of it." He turned the book over in his hands, not opening it, and was quiet for a moment in the way he gets when he's deciding whether to trust an answer or worry it further on his own later. "I knew something was wrong," he said finally. "This morning, before anyone told me anything, I just knew, and I didn't know how to say it to anyone, so I just sat there." He was quiet again for a moment, turning the book over once more, and then, in the careful, halting way he tells you the parts he's least sure he's allowed to talk about, he told me the rest of it. The first, and as far as I know, the only time he ever described that room to anyone in full. He said the man had seemed kind enough at first, and that the questions about his cough and his sleep had felt ordinary, almost boring, the sort of thing he'd answered at every checkup he could remember. He said it was the other question, the one about whether anything had been troubling him lately, that had made his stomach go tight and cold, because he'd understood, without being told, exactly what the man was really asking, and he hadn't known whether telling the truth or telling a careful lie was the more dangerous thing to do, so he'd done neither and simply said no, and hoped that would be the end of it. "I kept looking at the door," he told me. "I don't know why. I just kept thinking, if I look at the door enough times, someone's going to come through it." He said he remembered the curtain being drawn, and not liking it, and not knowing why he didn't like it, only that the room had felt smaller and darker in a way that made the man's voice seem louder even though it hadn't changed at all. He said that when Dennick had first put his head through the door, he'd felt something in his chest loosen just slightly, the way it does when you've been holding your breath without noticing, and that when his father finally came through it properly, he had felt, more than anything else, simply and enormously relieved, not frightened by what might have happened, because he told me plainly that he still didn't fully understand what almost had. But relieved the way you are when a thing you couldn't name suddenly isn't yours to carry alone anymore. I did not press him for more than that, and I have not asked him about it since, because I have found, in 11 years of this work, that children tell you the whole of a hard thing exactly once, in their own time and their own order, and that asking them to tell it again for your own understanding serves the asker a great deal more than it serves the child. What he gave me that afternoon was enough. It confirmed, more than any registration paper or telephone call ever could, that Dennick's read of that room had been exactly right, and that whatever the false Dr. Renshaw had intended to do once the curtain was drawn and the family's presence dispensed with, it had never once been about a lingering cough. "You didn't have to say it," I said. "You looked at me the way we agreed you would, and I was watching for exactly that look. That's how it's supposed to work. You did your part perfectly." I do not think a boy his age fully believes a sentence like that the first time he hears it, and I did not expect him to. But something in his shoulders eased a little, the particular loosening of a child who has been carrying a worry too large for him and been allowed, finally, to put a portion of it down. Rowan came in a few minutes later, and Alara after him, and I made my excuses and left the three of them to the rest of that afternoon, because whatever healing needed to happen from there belonged to a family, not to the man who guards its doors. I met Princess Malin in the corridor on my way out, sitting on the window seat where she liked to wait when she sensed something was happening that no one would fully explain to her, which was, I think, a great deal more often than any 9-year-old ought to have to sense. She looked up at me with the particular directness she has, so unlike her brother's careful watchfulness, and asked me plainly whether Torin was in trouble because of what she'd told their nurse about the man in the gray coat. I told her, as I had told him, that neither of them had done anything wrong, that the man in the gray coat had never been the trouble at all, and that grown-ups sometimes made a great deal of noise over things children mention in passing, through no fault of the children who mentioned them. She considered that for a moment with the particular seriousness she brings to most things, and then asked whether she was still allowed to tell me if she saw something odd again, because she'd started to worry, she said, that telling people things only caused problems. It struck me, hearing that, as one of the more important things I would say all week. I crouched down to her level the way I had once crouched behind a refreshment tent for her brother, and told her that telling the truth to someone who loved her had never once been the problem, in this affair or in any other, that the problem had only ever been what a grown-up chose to do with that truth, and that she was never, under any circumstance, to start keeping things to herself simply because one grown-up had once handled the truth badly. She seemed satisfied with that in the brisk, moving-on way children her age often are, and asked if she could go find Torin now, and I told her she could, and watched her go with the odd, quiet pride I sometimes feel toward children who are not my own but have somehow become, in 3 years of walking half a step behind them, very nearly as good as it. I think about that morning more often than I expected to, given how quietly in the end it resolved. There was no struggle in that consulting room, no blow landed, no chase through the palace grounds. Only a crown prince's raised hand held steady in a doorway, a captain's fax sheet held up beside a false name, and 2 days of ordinary, unglamorous checking that nobody would have thought to call heroic while it was happening. I have come to believe that most of the real protecting in this world looks exactly like that. Not the dramatic rescue, but the quiet refusal to accept an answer simply because it was offered smoothly and by someone with the standing to expect it unquestioned. There was, some 3 weeks later, a small ceremony in the private wing, nothing announced to the wider kingdom, nothing that made any newspaper, because the household had no wish to explain to the public why a sergeant of the guard was being recognized, which would have meant explaining the whole affair to people who had no need of it. It was simply the family, Captain Ashcombe, Dr. Wexley, and myself, gathered in a modest sitting room where King Alaric presented Dennick and me each with a small commendation medal I still keep in a drawer at home rather than displayed anywhere, because I have never quite known what to do with the idea of a medal for making a few telephone calls. Torin insisted on being there, and insisted further, with the particular stubbornness of a boy who has decided something matters to him, on being the one to hand me the small velvet box rather than letting his grandfather do it, which the king allowed with visible amusement. He did it formally, the way he'd clearly practiced beforehand, standing very straight and saying, "Thank you for staying outside the door," in a voice that wobbled only slightly at the end, and I have thought since that it was worth more to me than anything the king himself said that afternoon, kind as the king's own words were. My wife came to collect me afterward, waiting in the corridor outside as household spouses sometimes did on occasions like that one, and when I told her, walking out to the car, what the boy had said, she didn't say anything clever or comforting in return. She only took my arm, the way she has for 20 years of nights I've come home late and unable to say much about why, and said that it sounded like exactly the sort of thing worth doing a job like mine for. I have not found, in 11 years of service, a better summary of it than that. Dr. Wexley still keeps his patients' charts the same unhurried way he always did, though I notice now that he asks 1 or 2 more questions than he used to whenever a new name crosses his desk, and I don't think he'll ever entirely stop. Dennick and I do not speak of that morning often, but I know he checks the garden gate log himself most weeks, without being asked, the same way I do, because some habits are worth keeping even after the danger that taught them to you has passed. Captain Ashcombe was given a formal commendation for the affair, which he accepted with the same plain discomfort he shows whenever anyone tries to make more of his job than he believes it deserves, and he has told me since, more than once, that the true credit belonged to a sergeant who brought him 3 loose threads instead of letting them lie. Queen Consort Morwenna and I have exchanged perhaps a dozen words since that morning, all of them entirely correct, entirely proper, and entirely empty of anything either of us actually means by them, which is, I have come to understand, simply how some doors close in a household like this one, not with an argument but with a permanent and mutual carefulness. Rowan sought me out privately, some weeks after the ceremony, in a way he had never quite done before, not as a crown prince addressing a member of his household's guard, but as one man thanking another for something that had cost him more than either of us cared to name plainly. We stood together for a while at the edge of the stable yard, near the same low wall where Torrin had first told me about the man in the gray coat, and Rowan admitted to me, in a voice pitched low enough that it was clearly meant for no one else, that the hardest part of the whole affair for him had not been the fear in that consulting room, but the days afterward, lying awake and turning over every ordinary morning he had ever handed his children over to someone else's care without a second thought. Wondering how many other mornings had held a danger he simply never happened to notice. I told him what I believed to be true, which was that a father cannot personally verify every hour of his children's lives, and was never meant to, and that the answer to that fear was not to try to see everything himself but to build, carefully and deliberately, a household of people who would notice on his behalf what he could not always be present to notice himself. A physician who asks 1 extra question, a guard who makes 1 extra telephone call, a gatehouse that keeps its logs properly, a secretary who confirms a thing twice before acting on it once. That, I told him, was not a failure of vigilance on his part. It was what vigilance, properly understood, actually looked like in a household as large and as watched as his. He was quiet for a while after that, looking out over the yard, and then he said something I have carried with me since nearly as often as the king's own words in the study that day, that he had grown up believing a crown prince's chief duty was to be seen to be strong, and that it had taken watching a sergeant of his household guard stand quietly outside a door for 2 days, saying almost nothing to anyone, to understand that the strength that actually mattered rarely announced itself at all. Torrin still collects his maps. He came to find me himself, a week or so after it was all finished, in the corridor outside the guardroom, and asked, in the careful voice he still sometimes used when he wasn't sure a question was allowed, whether I thought it would be all right if he went back to the old gallery sometime to look at the charts again. I told him it would be entirely all right, that the room had never been the trouble, and that I would be glad to walk him there myself if he wanted the company. He did want it, as it happened, and we went together the following Saturday, and stood for the better part of an hour in front of a case of sea charts 300 years old, while he pointed out the drawn monsters in the margins and told me, with the easy, unguarded delight of a boy who has stopped watching the door, exactly which ones he thought the old cartographers had simply made up. I stood beside him the whole time, the same half-step behind I have always stood, and I did not need to check a single thing.